Have you been wondering how to build a successful strategy with open source for your company? Or why would you invest in open source projects when you can use the code for free? Are you an open source maintainer on the edge of burnout? Or a newcomer who's too intimidated to take the first steps and get involved? Maybe you're not a code developer and you think that there's no place for you in the open source ecosystem. You're not alone. My name is Ildiko Vancha, and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where my guests and I share our open source journeys with all the successes, the struggles, and joyful moments. Find the answers to your questions and dilemmas, and more importantly, join us and be part of the community. In the first segment, Austen Bryan shares a story about why it's not a good idea to assign people to a different topic area than what they were hired for, and also shares why it's important to collaborate in the open source ecosystem to succeed in your field.
Not sure how to ask this question, but let me give it a try. First off, it would be interesting to understand how much further upside and growth do you see just working with your current major customer, which is the US government. And a follow-on to that is many critical systems moving to a cloud-native environment with significant distribution of software also can significantly benefit from an air-gapped, highly secure deployment, continual deployment environment. Let's take telco, for instance, and the edge and IoT tied to those. These are all places where that could very well be a new market opportunity for a tool set and a value chain and a marketplace like what you described, totally separate from the national security that you've started on. What do you see as the growth pattern to where you are right now with your customer base? And are you contemplating or have you contemplated other significant industries as they continue to evolve?
Yeah, that's a much better question for my CEO. So if he ever listens to this, I want him to know that. Because I will say, as I've learned about product leadership, it's tied hand in hand to what I'll call go to market, which is another buzzwordy overloaded term. But you have to, when you're building product, you have to understand how it's going to be promoted, priced, placed, distributed. And so I do think I do spend a lot of time thinking about this. We actually served a lot of what I'll call regulated markets, to include financial and healthcare, when we first started. It's not that wasn't the right thing for us. It's just that we recruited people here that were defense minded, and then we put them on the other contracts and they weren't happy. And so it became, again, it's not about customers. It was more a mismatch of our marketing and recruitment and our customer base. So no fault of anybody. We just had to kind of make a pivot there, because at the end of the day, our software developers are our critical asset. And if they're not happy, we were willing to walk away from lucrative work to keep the people happy. And I hope that's a thing at Defense Unicorns that never goes away. But to your point, as we grow and expand, I would not be surprised if we found other markets again, right? But we would have to, this time, the lesson learned for me is we would have to change our recruiting strategy and maybe even business segmentation and a lot of, COO, CFO type words that I'm probably not even familiar with, but I would support. But I'll give you an example, right? We know the veteran affairs, that's not Department of Defense, National Security. A lot of us at this company are veterans and deeply care that they get served well. And so we would be very happy to work with Veteran Affairs tomorrow. And I just think that'll stack in other areas. You see fintech in particular, finance and healthcare really need as underserved markets, but also the Department of Energy, right? The Department of Energy is running very critical. I was in San Antonio in 2021 and I'm a Midwesterner, so I'm used to snow. It snowed there for 2 days and I lost power for 4 days. And if you want to remind yourself what chaos really is, be anywhere where there's no power for 4 days, especially in a place where they've never lost power before. And all of a sudden, it's Hunger Games in the streets. You can't even, all the gas stations were shut down, the grocery stores. You can't get food, you can't get gas. People get real squirrely real fast. And so Department of Energy, right? I think eventually, these are all critical infrastructure things that need the same type of services. That's why I think one of our passions, I think we align really well with OpenSSF, because their mission is really about securing open source. And when I think about Defense Unicorns and what we do, it's very similar. And we are working with them because they're a nonprofit, trying to get defense people that are active to come sit, come talk, because there's like an ecosystem of really bright people creating good things, and then there's people in creating policy and they're not talking to each other. And then, you know, there's vendors like ourselves being left in the middle trying to satisfy two different similar but different things, and it starts depleting the business case, right? Then you're like, well, I don't want to work with those people because we can't stay profitable if we do it. And so going back to that like ecosystem building in open source, like we've really been trying to double down with OpenSSF as they grow. Like, hey, can we get some of our networking customers to come be a part of the nonprofit discussion so that we can sit around the same table twice a year and be like, hey, you guys are doing salsa, we're doing other things. Like, can we make it all the same because it's 90% the same? You guys just aren't talking to each other, right? And you know how frustrating that can be when you're trying to keep two different customer segments happy, right?
Yep.
In the next two segments, Wolfgang Gehring shares some stories about the challenges of internal communication and how InnerSource can help resolve them.
I noted that you called yourself the open source guy in the company, and it's strange that there always seems to be just, you know, a handful of open source guys in any given company. That, you know, your responsibility is to understand what's going on out there in those communities, what risks, what opportunities exist, and then bringing that into the company, as well as InnerSource. So was the InnerSource journey for you based around reuse, or improved collaboration between teams, or where did that manifest?
So first of all, you know, call myself the open source guy. I'm one of them. You know, there are others,
exactly,
of course, as well. So I mean, so my job title is FOSS ambassador. So I have a role also in that. And now InnerSource, you asked about InnerSource. So I had this was also about 2017 or 18. I can't remember exactly. I ran into a work colleague, and I hadn't seen him in a while. And so this was, you know, I ran into him at work. You know, this was when not everybody was working from home, so people actually still went to the office, right? And so I said, hey, so hey, how's it going? What's going on? What are you doing? And he said, blah blah blah, and we're working on this. We're working on a translation component who translates this into that. And then I said, huh, that's very interesting. Have you by any chance talked to your neighbors next door in the office right next to yours? Because I think they are also working on something similar, translation component. I seem to remember, you know, something in the back of my head there. And he said, yes, actually, in fact, we have, you know, because when you're in the same office or right next door, you obviously talk. And so I said, okay, that's cool. And is it similar to what you're doing? And he says, yeah, that's really similar. And um, we you know, we looked into this and we thought, hey, if we could just write one component that both teams could use, you know, maybe in a more generalized fashion, but then both teams can use it. We could save a lot of development time and money. And I said, I started to get excited because, you know, I was already advocating InnerSource, and then I said, okay, amazing. And how is it going? You know, how is that working out for you? And he said, well, you know, so we both went to our product owners. Our product owner somewhere here in the company, and the other product owner somewhere over there in a big company. And then we introduced the idea to them, and they thought it was a great idea. And so I got more excited. And then it's like, and how's it going? It's like, well, then we decided we were not going to do it. Like, what? Wait, that's a bummer. Why? And so the thing is, you know, we didn't have the requirements basically that were needed, the prerequisites. And so everybody was working on a different technical platform, you know, so, you know, there's GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket Stash, TFS, whatnot, right? And so that obviously makes it more difficult to collaborate. And the legal requirements weren't there. Sounds funny, but we weren't even allowed to exchange code within departments within Mercedes-Benz, you know, because there are contracts, you know, and whoever's the money giver had the exclusive rights to the code. And if you wanted to share it with somebody else, working for someone else in the same company, you had to ask. And they were like, oh, I'm not so sure how this works. We have these contracts and blah. Okay. So that, and then the mindset sharing, that was also not there yet. But mainly also, yeah, the all these requirements. And so I was like, this is impossible. We cannot, we have to collaborate. And everybody's like, yes, of course. So that's when I really started to advocate InnerSource, and I said, look, how is it can't be that I cannot share the code with my colleague in the same company for some contract reasons. It's not like we're giving this code away to an external company. Yeah. So, and everybody's like, yeah, that's not right. Okay, let's do something here. So it's kind of the InnerSource story, like my personal InnerSource story.
Did ever those two teams, like, did it get sorted out so they could work on that common component, or was that the trigger to fix the underlying challenge for other teams in the future?
Yeah, so I don't think they actually ended up being able to work on the same component, but that was the trigger. I mean, that was the trigger for me to advocate more and more InnerSource, and that was one of the examples that I used a lot and say, look, we can't go on like this, right? We have to change something, and then our management listens and understands, and sometimes this then gets picked up and things change.
I remember that I think it was Claire Dillon who mentioned similar challenges at places where she worked or she was involved, and she's also with InnerSource. She was with InnerSource Commons, so she also learned similar stories. This sounds like that this is not very specific to Mercedes, but other companies are fighting the same challenge of the internal structure, and as you say, though, how those contracts were structured at the time, they were sort of actively blocking teams from being able to work together and share code and knowledge and experience as well, I assume. So when you started to advocate for InnerSource methods, the fact that a term and concept of InnerSource existed was helpful to advocate for more collaboration within the company, was enough to get started when you were starting to talk to people and advocate for the idea?
The term itself came up a few years before, right? But at that time, it was really, most people knew open source, but InnerSource wasn't a thing yet, right?
Right.
So I mean, a lot of times you're like, what is InnerSource? Oh, it's like open source, except it stays within the company, and then people understand, right?
And when you were advocating, were you pointing out challenges, or were you more pointing out the advantages of collaborating inside the company? What was your strategy to get from the idea to execution and get the buy-in from people?
So, good question. So I mean, of course, I went from the meetup to another department meetup and told the story, basically the story that I just told you, and to get everybody to understand the problem and to see there's something we need to do. And then, in the big corporation Mercedes-Benz, it was taken into the IT strategy, so that it had the four parts. It had open source usage, open source collaboration, with like contributions, open source publications of your own, and InnerSource. So InnerSource was one of the four pillars in that strategy. And then of course we had to talk about the challenges. So how can we fix the contracts, or how can we fix that we have so many different technological platforms and so forth? Then that helped that we could work on these things.
As you were diving into this advocacy work, do you remember what was the most challenging? like things that people didn't understand or they had a misconception about, or they were just not open to change, like a process or way of working just because it's been in place for so long, or maybe something else?
A few things come to mind. I mean, in IT, with the IT folks, it was an easier thing because I guess, as IT, you're used to constant change anyway, to new technologies anyway, all the time. You were already familiar with open source. You were just not using it at work and things like that. But now you have to convince other parts of the company as well. For example, the legal department, right? And so when we first got together with the legal department and told them what we wanted to do, they came to the table and they said, so we understand that you guys want to give away software that we wrote with company money for free. We're sure this is a misunderstanding, but what is it that you want? Said, and we said, well, actually, that's exactly what we want. And then he said, well, but why does that make any sense? And then we explained it to them why it makes, and then they started understanding. And obviously at the same time, we had no idea of what the legal challenges were because we didn't speak their language either. And so they told us, but this poses certain problems or certain challenges, and then we have to talk about these. So it was a lot of um, trying to understand what the other side, I mean, other side in quotes, because we're the same company. So, but like, why is this a legal requirement? And then, they told us, and then they said, why do you even want to do this? This is dangerous. And we're like, no, wait, it's not dangerous because. And so it was really interesting. And, but, I mean, the main point is you have to get together and listen to each other, right?
Did you end up with an advocate in the legal department? Somebody who was like, what is this open source thing anyway? How does this work? What are these licenses? Who are these other people who are the other legal people in this ecosystem that I can talk to? Did you find anybody that was like that? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't.
No, absolutely, yes. So we really found open ears, in the legal department, and I mean to this day we have our regular meetings, and there are people from the legal department, and some understand open source from the core, some are learning or have learned, but we have people from the legal team and governance team, and they're very close connected, and they have an open source mindset now as well. For the most part, I mean, sometimes they're, of course, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but and that's just it, right? I mean, they're a legal person's viewpoint on any given situation. They're always going to look at it differently than the developers or those that are trying, or the technical folk that are trying to get something technical done, right? But that's exactly why you bring them together, because it's a different viewpoint.
I mean, it's their job to prevent risk from the company and endangering the company. And then it's the job of the engineers and tech people to advance technologically and get innovation on the road. And that sometimes is contradictory. Sometimes engineers would do many things that might not be so good for the company from a risk and legal point of view. So it's very important that you talk to each other. But so as I said, our legal people there have a great mindset and are really helpful. Trying to let's make this happen and not let's prevent it, right? That of course is a change, and over time. But all in all, it's working really well.
In the next segment, Magnus Buhrgard talks about some of the challenges of applying InnerSource at telecom vendor companies and highlights the benefits of going all the way and doing open source. Even on this podcast, and I think individually as well, we talk to quite a few people whose companies are using InnerSource. Is that something that you saw in the telecom ecosystem as well, catching on?
I see a lot of initiatives around InnerSource. to save money and time to utilize what has been done in the other parts of the company. In some cases, it works well, but in other cases, it's also this dependency that you have to rely on someone else to get the new version of what you had, and also that it is difficult to put up a contract within a company. So if you have a manufacturer, or if you have a customer to a software company, you can put up a contract, and you can source that code, and you can sort of demand that it will be updated and fixed and so on. Within the company, it's very difficult to put up these contracts. So people are a bit hesitant to that. I also think that you should strive for open source instead. Because if you have this InnerSource, you get some benefits, but you don't get the benefits of where you get a dialogue with the rest of the industry and so on. So very difficult to set up actually in practice, because people don't want to promise anything, and the promise within the company is not that much worth, because you're really not the customer. You are depending on people's goodwill, and sometimes that goodwill moves away. So that's I think it's better if you're in a bigger society. If it doesn't work out in the bigger industry, you have to go revert back and develop yourself. But then you have the code base, and you have the right to use that code, and you just have to acknowledge that you have to do it yourself.
Yep.
In the next segment, Ashan Senevirathne talks about some of the challenges of doing open source at telecom companies and highlights the importance of upstreaming changes rather than maintaining local forks. Different people and different parts of the company having different levels of understanding when it comes to open source. What are the most common concerns and questions and challenges that you've seen people have or people asked you about?
I think one of the biggest challenges was understanding the community dynamics, because each community has its own way of working and the culture and also own rules. But once you understand the principles of collaboration, it becomes much easier to get involved and make meaningful contributions, I think. And one of the main things is, if you're contributing to a project, we should bring some value to the community, not just the sake of committing some code, because it adds overhead on maintaining the code base for the community, right? So that's also something we need to balance. Yeah.
Has it ever been challenging to show people the value of both relying on open source code as well as to invest in upstream work and upstream involvement? Like, even when you're not contributing code, you still can be involved in the project in various other ways.
It's going okay so far. Like, we haven't had any challenges like on such cases. Obviously, within the organization, for the sake of open sourcing such things, like, not that the whole organization like accepts it, right? So you there are certain pockets that you need to do more convincing, show the value of open sourcing, and also making use of open source tools, because not every team is up to the speed of the technology stack that we use. And having said that, we also need rest of the organization to follow us and follow the journey, because they will need to start some of these tools at some point. So it's also the shift in the culture that we see, as well as the skills we need, slowly evolving that way. Yeah.
I remember it being the practice in the past that a vendor or partner company did contributions as opposed to the operator or even the telecom vendor. Is that still a practice, or do operators and vendors do the open source engagement themselves more today?
I don't know the engagement of the vendors, but I believe they do collaborate with these organizations or bodies within large organizations like Linux Foundation or CNCF. For us, it's been a direct engagement. So we within Netbox, if you want to open source the code or host the code base with Netbox community, it was a direct engagement from our side.
I remember when I was working for Ericsson, they had partnerships with Mirantis, Red Hat, and others as well. And sometimes, as part of those partnerships, Mirantis or Red Hat would work on features upstream as opposed to people who were employed by Ericsson. So I wonder if you have like any vendors who you're working with who might ship components to you with open source in it. So is it still a standard practice to have the vendor do upstream work on those and maybe in other projects as well? Or is the preference more to do as many things yourselves as possible? Because in the past, it didn't really feel like that was an approach to try to reach the state where either a telecom operator or a telecom vendor does the upstream work themselves. That wasn't the goal in the past, at least 9 years ago, in my personal experience.
The operator should do the upstream work where it makes sense. It's not something that operators can do by themselves, not the whole thing, right? So certain aspects need to come from the vendor, and we highly encourage them to use open source tools because there's a larger development or developer community, and also it's quite fast evolving. So it's highly encouraged. But one observation that I see is from the vendor side, due to the hardening or whatever reasons, they tend to fork an open source project and they go down in that own path without upstreaming these changes. So it has blocked us in some automation capabilities because we do the integration by ourselves. Yeah, I think for the vendors, one of the messages I want to give is then, or one of the asks is, if you're using open source tools, be truthful and upstream your changes, and don't fork and go in a different direction because it also blocks us in our automation. Yeah.
So that is a challenge that you experience as well after receiving that package and code.
Yeah.
And I'd say from my experience, I see pretty much an entire spectrum of how different organizations, and also including internally within Ericsson, how they engage with upstream projects. I think both Ericsson and Swisscom are collaborating in the NEFIO project. We've definitely got folks there working significantly. And then there are places like MetalCube that's very important to the telco industry and important to Ericsson in the sense that we want to be able to deploy on bare metal in our various regimes, be it in packet core, be it more in the RAN, more in the radio access network. So we end up taking a lead there. But it's also the case that there are certainly projects and development teams inside of Ericsson where what I usually run into is a belief that the features that are being done, be it hardening or what have you, aren't actually wanted by the upstream project. And so in some cases, that's true. In other cases, I think it's a miscommunication between the project of the users within the company and what the upstream community is actually asking for. Because as you know, right, one of the things that you need to learn when you're engaging with an upstream project is, phrase it as what would be the benefits to the upstream project as to why such features would be desirable, as
Exactly.
opposed to just
What's the
for
value?
the end user.
Exactly.
Exactly. And then it's often the case that, you know, the use case of one company is partial, right? But you might want to do something more substantial. You need to add more features, you need to add more tests, you need to have more use cases covered. So there's additional work that's beyond just what's necessary for that one company if you're going to put it into an upstream community that's leveraged by lots of different users with lots of different use cases. So that's the balance, and it is sometimes perceived by those users as, well, they don't want my changes. And that's not quite what's being said. It's just that there's more work and there's more collaboration that has to be done to actually have them accepted. And in the end, as you know, you've alluded to some of the benefits of not having a local fork, but actually having all of those features upstream. And I would argue that there's more, because, you know, always trying to do those backports as new versions of those upstream projects come along is a lot of work as well, right? So that dialogue I've had with many companies. Ericsson is one of them, but they're not alone in having this.
I can imagine,
This is a misconception. Yeah. So it's definitely a journey for the companies.
In the next segment, Stormy Peters highlights some of the legal challenges of working upstream and how to resolve them. I assume the review board was working in the direction of incoming software that you were using downstream. Were you also looking into involvement in the projects, like how much people at HP at that time started to also work on that open source code upstream?
Yes, there was the focus in the very beginning was very much on inbound software, like that's what happened. People used software. At one point, someone said, you know, our job was to make sure that no IP left the company, and I got that altered to no IP unintentionally left the company, because we did want to contribute back. And then I think for all companies, it's tricky for them in the beginning of, do you review each patch or each pull request as it goes out, or do you give people blanket approval to work on something? And I think that's a big hurdle that a lot of companies have to get comfortable with.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know about you, Stormy, but I found that period of time to be really interesting, because we had a relationship between the open source review board and the rest of the IA64 Linux team that was actively engaged in upstream development of an entire architectural branch of Linux, which was the IA64. And we were working in collaboration with Intel very closely on brand new features of the EPIC architecture that had never been seen in the planet before. And we were working with the engineers on when we would time the introduction of the of enabling that feature in the operating system, coincident with the new processor version that was coming out. And we were there was no formal review process. We were doing this out of common sense and what we knew were the important things with intellectual property protection for Intel, what was important for HP. And we had a very tight knit group. I mean, we were one row over from the engineers who were doing the work. And so that's how tight that relationship was. And it wasn't formal, but as I stop and think about that, that was probably the most complex contribution activity I have ever done. And it was the most informal. And it's because it just nothing formal really existed at that time. We knew what we were doing. We knew what we needed to protect. We talked a lot with the developers so that timing was right, because we had to put it in the kernel because to enable the platform, but we didn't want to do it prematurely. So, and again, and everybody had to say yes, but it wasn't a formal process. It was just something that was done between those engineers and the folks running the policy. It was, yeah, and like I said, and it was the most consequential and worked really well.
I think it always works well if you share with the people doing the work what the concern is and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, yeah.
Another mistake that I saw is like having a head of open source or OSPO kind of person being on the marketing payroll and, like being part of the marketing budget, because that resulted in two things. One, when there were budget cuts, the person's role was cut because being, on marketing headcount, the person had virtually zero influence over how product development was going and how the use and investment in open source was happening. So they had like really not much influence. They couldn't really make a difference from that position, and it's really bad and it's really sad to see, because it really does matter like how you set up these roles and how you set up these organizations. Because if someone is put into the wrong department in a company, then you just set up the person to fail, and then you spend money on something that's never going to work. And in that case, that really didn't work. Like, there were a lot of great ideas, but it never made it into the engineering organization in almost any shape or form. And yeah, it's crazy sometimes how badly these organizations, or even just a single role, is set up in large companies with multiple departments, because they don't really think it through, what the influence of the role is, what the goal of that role is, and how they will achieve that goal in different circumstances. So there are a lot to consider.
What I thought about is, it's also often that it's a person who get this role, but it's really hard to fulfill a certain like range of levels and people to talk to. So when I was getting from my former company from Aided into Bosch centrally, there was another guy from the open source field, and what I really see, he could speak and motivate up to the higher level of management, and he had hard times to get down to the engineering side, really, to talk to the engineers, because they were like, what kind of story are you making up here? And for me, it was like, I could talk to the engineers, but I really struggled and to go to upper management and tell them the story, because I'm not using the word, the vocabulary and the way, or I don't see their perspective. And it was so great when Stefan came in and just said, they will ask this and that, prepare these kind of things. And I don't know how often it just came true that exactly what he considered was happening in these meetings with the managers, that they exactly ask what he said, that is what they will ask. But he then came and was like, when you explain it, it's like you get the touch to the developers. And that's how we had a good split. And we were both taking like 50% of the job, but we had an overlap of area in which we have a good level of communication. He was taking more of the upper part and was going down to the others. So they're like having a marketing person, even if it's not like, can be helpful in the way how they communicate, which may not be the thing which you had, like getting some money in for you or for a project or so. But if the marketing person is just pure marketing, we also had this, and sometimes you don't understand what to sell and they may give wrong information. And if you give wrong information in an open environment, the people will identify and say, this person knows nothing. This is wrong information. So I better don't rely on what this person is saying. So you really need to fill the stack, and it's hardly possible for a single person. There are these exceptions, these lighthouse, but I also like to see splits in there, which is, okay, this is what I can cover. That's what I'm not covering. Where is the person who covers this? Let's split it both to 50%. We share this position and collaborate in this field.
Do you remember any examples, like when you were working with that person and he was communicating towards the management and you were communicating towards the engineers? Do you remember any particular story of how, I don't know, you pushed an initiative through the whole chain, or how you translated something that was coming from the management down to the engineering level, and vice versa?
What I remember from him definitely was super impressive. So this comes to my mind directly was we were in negotiations and trying to get some funding part on it. And the manager from the other department just said, no, we don't have money for these kind of activities. And I was, okay, yeah, I can explain it once more. So explain once more what I thought. And it was still like, no, we don't get the money for it. And then Stefan just started to explain. I was just going forward, and it's like I didn't feel comfortable anymore. But he has recognized something in there, and he just brought this discussion forward, just putting lights on it, on the benefits, on certain economical situation. And like 10 minutes later, I don't know, for whatever reason that made this change, this person turned around and said, yeah, okay, you get the budget. I was like, whoa. How did this happen? What have I missed, right? It was just impressive where you could see this. And then on the contrary side, we also had this, that there was an engineer who had really strong concerns on working in the open. So he was in this open source centric project, and he always said, no, that's too much risk. I don't want to do this, and so on. And I couldn't imagine this, because this was a guy who really, he gave trainings in the open. He was working with open source software since more than a decade. And I was like, okay, let's talk to him. And I was just touching it and say, okay, what is your point on it? And it turned out that his main concern was that he could unveil customer information, intellectual property parts, and couldn't split the hats which he wears, so that he would mix up his product development, customer-centric role to the open source part, because he wouldn't be full-time one or the other. He had to do it like with 20% of his time.
My concern, actually.
Yeah. And what we were looking at is like, okay, the technology world is super huge. So I said, what are your capabilities? What are technologies you're interested in, and what we're currently searching for? And we figured out that there was a gap in an area. So he was not aware, he was not knowing the build tooling, but he knew build tooling from the past. He wasn't knowing the RTOS, but he knew RTOS from the past. He was not knowing the distribution we were using, but he knew another distribution. So what was then for him, I said, could you imagine to do this, that, and the other part? Do you see any conflicts? He said, no, this works for me. And the thing is, he could bring a lot of experience into the project. He could take things out of the project. And over the time, just getting into it, he learned, like, what can I share? Maybe I don't have to share. I remember when he came in and said, I'm writing to these people. We have never met. They don't know who I am. And they respond just to my question. And I said, yes, why not? You ask a valid question. They are interested in what you're doing, so they will give a response. And it's like, I have never experienced this before. Typically, they ask what the cost center, what are happening, and so on. Why should I do? I'm busy or so. And then 2 weeks later, he also came like, they are not responding anymore. So yeah, maybe they are busy now and doing other work. You have no direct control of all of them. Okay, and then he just continued. So it's not like take it for granted. And he said he was also impressed by talking to maintainers and could experience how much technology they understand. And this was hard for Stefan, my other part, because he was not able to get on the little details of the embedded products, because he came from a different product field. He was still understanding technology and could spot and grab, like, this could be a chance for a new technology. But then he would always bring it to an engineer and say, to level, like, let's discuss about it. And for him, he was telling all his stories, and the engineer understood all these stories. But he had a practical engineering problem to solve, and not an open source problem. It was at the end like, how do I separate my interests? And this was really where I could say we could bring this forward and have convinced another person. And basically, I guess from all the persons which we brought in to conferences the first time who speak or did submissions. So basically for the conference, I said it was such a great experience. They learned something new. I brought one who had this first talk ever, sitting there and being the next speaker, and the previous speaker was just taking longer. It was over time, already like more than 5 minutes. There was a 5 minutes break, and he was 5 minutes into his talk. And I said, oh, I'm so super sorry. It takes so much longer. And you're sitting here and waiting. I said, no, it's super interesting. It's related to a customer thing I'm currently doing. It saves me a lot of time. You can talk forever. I don't need my talk. Basically like this. And then so he came like, I learned so much, and it was so great being here. And then on the patching thing, like commits, like, I've done this commit. I had to do several iterations. They were not happy with my comments. I had to change the commit message. Literally, functional-wise, everything was fine. It was just these things around this, which I all had to change, from code style, documentation, formalities. But now it's better documented. So yeah, that's the intention of it. And it's like someone else can maintain. And we were in the beginning touching all these kind of standards, right? And saying like he was developing to the level he was used to. And this made it, and it's good enough for products. But the level to bring it into the open, to make it maintainable, consumable by others, and we know this, a person leaves the project and nobody understands, so you have to rewrite software again, right? Because nobody can maintain whatever code was written. And then you also call the experts in a fire thing, like it's a burning issue, nobody can solve, but you need this special expert because he's the one most likely written the code where nobody else could solve the thing. So it's like a self-core thing. And this is what experience the people made. And it really it was so much fun, like to have like these 10 people in a year, 10, 12 people, which just make new experiences and went to the open and somehow also took it. Like the one engineer who was hesitating to do open source, at the end he said, I don't want to do anything else anymore, because he's such a technology person and it's so great to talk with these great people, to do this work, do it for the technology interest and not just for money or for a customer. He still likes to have customers because it's like that's how get a reputation and so on. But it was a quite interesting experience for them. And it pays into like, here's quality, right? Especially with the patching thing, you could say. It creates a quality level, and it's directly the counter argument to those saying open source does not bring quality. Open source is not secure. Open source, like there is peer reviews almost everywhere. It's professional engineers writing these code, and they are committed to, with their heart, to the project they are maintaining, because it's a lot of extra effort often also.
In the last segment, Federico Gonzalez Waite talks about the challenges of doing open source in the public sector, especially in highly regulated areas, and shares an example of how to resolve them.
I'm curious, given the amount of change and the significant increase in users that you had, what has your engagement with different open source projects been? So you've taken the software, you're starting to leverage it. You're adding features, I'm assuming, when it doesn't quite fit. You're fixing bugs, you're fixing those vulnerabilities for you. What type of stuff did you push upstream, and what kind of formalized protocols did you have for doing that work?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I think that was kind of like where we were finalizing at the end of the last term. We had implemented our own open source community. So there was kind of like how we can reuse whatever has been developed within the government.
Right.
And you had to be a government agency, like it's not like a private participant could take it and then charge somebody to implement it. You had to be government. And it was there was kind of like an area that was looking at how, when these glitches or modifications were identified and made, how they were accepted and pushed upstream. So that was quite, you can say it was an internal process really of the government and the participants that were within that community. And that was quite interesting. Personally, Infotech was cooperating with, we had a partnership with MyFos for core banking platform. And that's when things became complicated for the government. Because of course we got the code, we developed the code quite a bit, and we started using the code. And the agency that started using the code, it's a financial institution, so they have to comply with a whole lot of financial regulations. So how much could we give back to the community? That was a debate that we could probably still be having if we hadn't come to a certain determination at some point. Because then it's like, if you give it to the community, then are you opening it up to vulnerabilities? And could somebody do some reverse engineering and actually find the vulnerabilities and hack the bank and all these kind of questions? So the decision that was made at the time was that the latest releases wouldn't be able to be sent back. And whichever version the bank was operating with, or the financial institution, because there's several that are using it now, whichever was active, that couldn't go back to the community. So once we did like a new version, or like we updated, like then we could look at what components of that we could be sending back. And that's where maybe the regulation, and I don't think like any country would probably be able to go that far, but it would be good to have these kind of guidelines in order to reassure what can you give back to the community. Because then once we did that, then I think it would be a lot more efficient. Because here it's like, unfortunately, as a public servant, like there's a lot of liability for you. So if anybody does misuse of whatever you return to the community, then it could probably spill back on you. So that's what limits, I think, a lot of these interactions. We took that decision with MIFOS, and fortunately, MIFOS were very receptive of this. And so that's kind of like one of the big challenges, no? Like of how do you keep the sovereignty and the integrity of the government while being part of a community.
You said something there that struck me, the way you had, something worked someplace, and so then it was leveraged in other places, and you collected the things that weren't working to be pushed upstream. That sounded an awful lot like InnerSource. Did you ever use that term in your government activities?
No, because it would have just complicated with another topic that people wouldn't understand properly.
Okay.
It's open source. It belongs to the government. We can use it. It's free. That was all they needed to know at the time. But yeah, when you think about it, yeah, it was more of an in-stream kind of thing and setup when you put it that way.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. What did resonate with you the most? What new ideas, strategy, or useful tips did you hear today? Or you have a comment or follow-up question to ask? Comment on the episode below, or start a conversation on your favorite social media platform. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast so others can discover it too. And stay tuned, because the next episode is just around the corner.